This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam, and I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people had so much to gain and had such an ulterior motive for putting me in a position I'm in. We'll never let the true facts come aboard to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader?
Don't remember his name.
You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
now these people are in very high positions, yeah.
Welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 148. I'm your co-host, Dimitri.
I'm Khaled.
And today, we're back with our first round of Grotto questions for 2023.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is Grotto Q&A number 20. We're at 20 now. XX.
Yeah, we've done 20 of these.
Yeah. We had a big push at the end of last year. I think we did like 4 in a row. And then, we've been quite busy since then, but figured it was time to check back in with the Grotto and see what's up and answer some questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we got I think 9 today lined up. I think we can get to them. We were talking before recording about like various strategies we could use to go faster through these questions. Though at the same time, I mean, that's almost part of the appeal at this point. I think for some people is that
I've always said,
spend,
how much does
it
really matter,
It only matters in the sense of I like spending an hour on every question. I'm totally cool with that. I guess it's a matter of working through the backlog because as we're starting today, we're still in November 2021.
Yes.
Right. But as we've pointed out many times, that there's often like a strange synchronicity thing where the question sort of ages like a fine wine, or it takes on a different context like a year later when we actually get to answering it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That happens quite a bit, and actually, it's going to happen I think a little bit today, as well as like some just evergreen ones that are interesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I think we're just gonna fly.
Yeah.
We're gonna freestyle it, and we're gonna see what happens. But I think we can make good progress today. So why don't we just jump in? You want to read the first one?
Sure, I will. Loich. Am I ever saying his name right? It has like an umlaut, I feel like, on the I in the Grotto. Loich, he is like French, right? So do you think ecological movements, do you think the youth ecological movements that have appeared the past few years can be compared to Wandervogels and possibly an indication of eugenics creeping their way back into popular discourse? Interesting.
I've heard this before. I've seen this pointed out.
Yeah. We've got a couple of questions from Loic that are like those kind of like comment questions where it's like, do you think like here's something that I'm proposing? But yeah, that's an interesting idea. I don't know. I mean, I think that there certainly can be a comparison made, but I don't know if I would like equate the two. I think there's like many different aspects of the context that like make each unique. But of course, there are, I think, as he observed, like certain themes that are consistent between them. Yeah.
I mean, I think, especially in the last few years, I think like Greta Thunberg certainly has a bit of a Wandervogel vibe, a little bit, even though I think historically in Germany, the Wandervogels were kind of male dominated and only certain kind of factions of them even let in girls. And in fact, it was sort of known for having a sort of homoerotic vibe to it. To some degree.
Yeah, it's kind of like a Boy Scout type thing, actually.
It was kind of like a Boy Scout thing.
Actually would be like a more, facile comparison, I guess.
Yeah.
Than to,
I just read...
I don't know, what's an example of a youth ecological movement like Extinction Rebellion or something?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent. Yeah, Extinction Rebellion would be one example, and... I'm trying to think about other ones, but just like radical anarchists, like eco-anarchists, perhaps, up in the Pacific Northwest might be kind of, I mean, honestly, the big comparison a lot of people make, I think like back in the day.
Like Deep Green Resistance.
I think back in the day, Jan Irvin used to talk about how like the hippies were like a remanifestation of like the Wandervogel and stuff. And of course he saw it as like this archaic revival,
honestly,
like Frankfurt School thing.
Honestly, yeah, I almost feel like that is also like a more like the concern with nature and like the opposition to industrial society, like in a way, but I feel like there is sort of a different orientation in a way where one has kind of that nostalgic cast to it, like obviously, whereas the other one is like, more like we need to like strategize a different future that's like away from this. It's not, doesn't necessarily
You're
have
saying
that.
Hippies are more like that?
No, hippies are like that, but I mean, he's talking about modern day youth ecological movements that have appeared in the past few years. Right. So
I see. Yeah.
I would say that.
That's right.
Yeah. Whereas hippies,
like
I do think actually had that kind of like nostalgic sort of, like a little bit of an archaic revival element, as we've talked about so many times, right? So
you're right, actually, that I think that
like primitivism, things like that. So
yeah, a lot of, even though I think, as we've like referenced before, that a lot of that like Extinction Rebellion type stuff today, even though a lot of it does play with like ideas of like deep ecology and like Murray Bookchin and things like that, and like these kind of eco-anarchist ideas, it has a much more kind of like big money tech NGO kind of gloss to it, and it's all about getting like the stakeholders in society to like build renewable energy, or to deindustrialize, or like promise they won't use oil anymore and things like that. It's very there's a very different kind of orientation in terms of it's much more like you're right, like politically focused, and is agitating for like very specific things, whereas maybe both the Wandervogels and the hippies, it was a little bit more
here's
not
what
as
I'll
politically laser focused.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not actually, I think that there is perhaps an element of like sort of experience seeking in like some like in activist movements like broadly, but it's a like, so my initial reflex was like, well, both Wandervogels and the hippie sort of movement, or the sort of that period of time, the cultural trends and that people compare to the Wandervogels. Those were definitely about like, having an experience of like going out into nature and disconnect, tuning out of industrial society, or, being anti-civ, and then going out and like having an experience like in the woods, getting away from society. Whereas again, I do think that people sometimes do have a like sort of thrill-seeking or experience-seeking orientation towards like activism, and I think that like when people like are getting like photo ops of themselves being arrested, like stuff like that, I think there is like an element of that to like contemporary activism in a way, but the experience that's being sought is like very different from like going off into the woods and like reviving old, Teutonic values or whatever,
Yeah. I don't think the Wandervogels would be publishing like how to blow up a pipeline. That kind of stuff, like a very performative kind of activism, or like school strike Fridays or whatever Greta was doing, or like shut down the metro. Like that doesn't seem like that was as much their vibe. They were more retreating from industrial society. And I mean, as the bringing up of eugenics is interesting because, well, it brings to mind the kind of interesting relationship between the Wandervogels and the Nazis, which I just read like a couple articles about this to get a little background. But, Hitler actually banned the Wandervogels pretty much completely after the Nazis came to power. And he actually outlawed hiking. He thought that hiking was like sus and basically like that. But what he did at the same time is he sort of took a lot of the like structures and the broad strokes of the Wandervogel movement and incorporated it into the Hitler Youth, which then every German child was like basically forced to join. So then in a sense, but then everything that was sort of, you know, more in the Wandervogel thing, more focused on like wandering around in nature and appreciating its majesty, things like that were all kind of gamified and changed into, so instead of going on hikes, you would go on marches. Instead of, you know, wandering around like picking flowers, you would play like capture the flag or hide and seek and like all these games, you know, that are kind of militarized. And so they managed to kind of, you know, kind of bend both the Wandervogel thing and like the Boy Scout movement and things like that. They managed to kind of meld together this new Nazi version of it, which, you know, Hitler was like a huge fan of. And then I guess even after World War II in East Germany, you know, in all the communist countries, you had the Young Pioneers, which is very much like a sort of boy Girl Scout type, you know, organization. And I guess I was just reading this, you know, so like grain of salt, but they were saying that, you know, hiking was also considered sus in East Germany for like slightly different Marxist reasons. Like it's a bourgeois pastime that's like hyper individualistic and blah, and you're like withdrawn from society and you're like opting out of like the political struggles that are going on around you by being like a hippie. Also interesting, one of the lasting legacies, I guess, of the Wandervogel movement is like the European sort of youth hostel kind of culture, you know? Like we've stayed in hostels before in various countries and stuff, and it's very common in Europe to like to this day, like backpackers and stuff kind of, you know, wandering around from city to city. And that was something that a lot of the Wandervogels like had set up these like travel hostels, I guess, throughout Germany before the Nazis came around. And so you get these kind of like hippie-ish, sort of long-haired, like scraggly hiker people that are kind of bohemian, like wandering, you know, from city to city, staying in these hostels and stuff. So, so that's still kind of around today, which is interesting. And I mean, eugenics. I do see eugenics vibes in the modern day climate movement, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I see eugenics vibes in a lot of things that are going on these days, and like particularly in the way a lot of these things converge and swirl together. You know, I think that, I don't know, there's many different things that we could probably like critique about things that low key are kind of like, I mean, and things in like the biotech sphere about, you know, gene editing, you know, embryos, like designer babies, CRISPR, you know, stuff like we talked about in the Ray Alien episode. These things, and just like the drive towards kind of optimization, all these weird like integralist Zoomers that are trying to like breed their children to be super children or whatever the fuck.
Well,
like,
yeah, I think that, I mean, and there is certainly like an environmental element to like Nazism that was like, yeah, and I think it's interesting how these, you know, what you were describing is actually pretty interesting, how the sort of instrumentalism of it like comes out, like again, yeah, like this sort of tendency of retreat at first, you know, maybe it was, I mean, I don't want to say that it was opposed to, I mean, it probably was in some ways opposed to like existing power, and perhaps in some respects always was seen to be oppositional to the objectives of Nazism, as many things were that just weren't under total control of the party. But, you know, it's interesting how that tendency then can be assimilated and can be directed in a way that is deemed to be useful once it is, you know, once a mode of controlling it is produced.
Yeah.
And I think that you can definitely,
I'm sorry.
I think you can definitely see aspects of that with the comparison to environmentalism. I think there's definitely, I mean, as you say, there's like an instrumental aspect. There's an instrumental aspect to all discourses. I mean, we've been talking about that to a lot of these discourses. Like we talk about that with reference to the criticism of the CIA, for instance, which has like been a big thing where it's like only like why is it that like Tucker is criticizing the CIA? Well, there's an instrumental purpose to it, and in fact, there's like a dialectic where the discourses that are produced by sort of one side in this dialectic, or one political faction, are then like inevitably marshaled against it by the opposing side eventually for subversive reasons. Like for instance, during the Bush administration, all like people like Tucker were cheerleaders for the Iraq War. They weren't critics of the CIA. They were anything like that. And it was people on the left political faction in the United States, who were critical of the intelligence community and things like that. Mm-hmm. Now, that's an amazing... It's not only that it's flipped, but that's a useful strategy to deploy against your opponents because you know that they credit that. You know that it will disarm them because you know they don't like the CIA. So to say like, oh, you're the CIA or something, that is, it's the same. Again, the analogy made before was to racism, I guess. Now racism is considered by both to... definitely has a negative connotation. No one wants to be accused of being... Generally, people don't want to be accused of being racist. But, obviously that hasn't been the case in their various times in American history. There have been people who have thought, the KKK, for instance, is good. Now, like, people will say, like, oh, the Democrats are the original KKK as, like, an insult, exactly. When in the past, yes. The sort of conservative faction in American politics would have been sort of concern trolling about whether the KKK really is so bad.
Exactly. Exactly. Whereas
so you see that with
now,
environmentalism, I think, as well, where it's like, oh, well, This is a great excuse to be eco-fascist if we want to be concerned about, like, the environment.
Absolutely. And you know what? It also goes back to what we were just talking about in our Sus Psychedelics series about, like, the way that psychedelics could be instrumentalized by, people really of kind of any political persuasion, but we're particularly talking about the right-wing co-optation of that. And when you look back at the hippies in the 1960s, we do see quite a bit of that, like, shot through it, where I don't think that all of the luminaries of, like, the 1960s were, like, secret Nazis, but you could definitely see certain manifestations of that kind of psychedelic counterculture start to spin off into, most obvious example would be Charles Manson, where he's using the trapping. And in fact, Charles Manson's big thing up until like when he died wasn't his slogan Atwa, which meant like air, tree, water, or something.
Yeah,
like he
sense.
Was like a hardcore kind of eco-fascist, basically. Especially in like his later years, like in prison, he was all about talking about the environment. And back when he was running around, kind of posing as this hippie, but he's actually kind of like a Nazi, like street pimp, person, who's, up to God knows what. He's like kind of luring all these people in and then, getting them goosed up on like psychedelics and speed and inculcating them with like some really wild eco-fascist shit that is, at least for a while, under the guise of being like beautiful and like all love. And, what's the song they sing? All is love, all is love, all is love. Like it like it's kind of happy, but also scary. But, so I think that there's like a kind of similarity there where even something that's very oppositional to like the system that's in power can either be manipulated or aspects of it can be appropriated by nefarious forces and then used with like a kind of a wolf in sheep's clothing kind of way. And I think getting everybody really scared and concerned about the climate and then offering like a very particular set of solutions and even framing that whole challenge in a very, very kind of narrow, specific way that we know, like the NGO movement and the kind of climate movement that is very establishment linked and very like very like American and EU dominated. You can kind of see them kind of launder through ideas that in other contexts would be not popular and not accepted by people, but like when pitched the right way, when spun with the right PR, then, you know, maybe people will do it. Like, I'm just thinking about kind of like Alison McDowell, like sort of dystopian visions of, you know, like future climate lockdowns kind of thing. People used to talk about that during the pandemic, about how this is kind of, this whole vaccine passport, lockdown kind of stuff is, this is kind of a trial run in the future. And I think even some like climate people were like openly kind of saying this back when there was much more public support for it. They were like, yeah, you know, this is a great thing. And like in the future, like when people are using too much carbon, like we could lock down for the climate.
Right. Well, there is the whole thing of like nature is healing because people are like inside more. I mean, there probably is some truth to that. Like if you turned off like a lot of these big like stadiums, you know, like the Astrodome and stuff like that, probably would be a big help. To the you know, solving these problems more so than like. Yeah. But that's the thing. Like it's
but implicit in that is that we're a disease, like we're a parasite on the earth, right?
I mean, well, we human beings aren't a disease or a parasite upon the earth, like necessarily. However, like the Houston Astrodome is a parasite on the earth. Like,
no, yeah. I mean, it's both true and I'm also resistant because, yeah, I think there's often a confusion between, instead of blaming the biggest sources of kind of pollution that exist, we end up blaming, like, we individualize it and personalize it in this very neoliberal way where the guilt is collectivized, right? Yes. And then the profits made off of the thing that caused the problem.
Well, it's not really fully collectivized because it's actually like we individual people bear it most.
You're right.
Whereas
it's regressive in a way where it hits like the masses of people the hardest, and then all these rich people can go to like Davos and say a bunch of bullshit and assuage their own egos and be celebrated for saving the world, and so they don't actually have to feel bad as they fly around, you know, in their private jets and whatever. So that's a shitty dynamic to have to deal with. And yeah, I mean, I'm just like generally a little bit skeptical of like really hardcore eco-anarchism or like climate change extremism of like, we just have to fucking do something now. And it's like, okay, yeah, but like what we decide to do is actually quite a significant question. And I don't think it's as simple as, I don't know, like these governments like America and like the EU, like saying, oh, like by 2030, we're going to have, you know, some ridiculous like emissions target. We're going to cut out all of our oil. But they absolutely hate nuclear energy. I don't know. It's like it has sus vibes to it because it doesn't feel like it's being. It feels like, you know, like China is maybe going about it in a kind of logical way where they're continuing to use dirtier energy because they are the world's industrial powerhouse and that's just what they're going to do. But they're also building like a ridiculous amount of like wind farms and like electric high-speed trains everywhere. And like they're clearly kind of prepping for, you know, like a gradual transition, like when they can, kind of moving towards a more ecologically sustainable kind of model. And honestly, I mean, because they have so much industry, they have much bigger challenges than we do. Though a lot of our lands are poisoned from when we were an industrial powerhouse. Like the town that my dad grew up in like central Connecticut, like this factory town. He said when he was growing up, when the rubber plants and stuff were there, the river was just pink. like all the time, like you couldn't swim in it. Like it was fucking pink. And like that was just sort of accepted by everybody as like, okay, like, I mean, but it was just like massive industrial waste and chemicals like floating down the fucking Naugatuck River. And, you know, now like that factory, I think, got torn down in the 80s and now it's a Superfund site. And, you know, there's nothing there anymore. But like the land is still probably poisoned and shit. Mm-hmm. And that's probably true of like so many places around the Rust Belt and like, and, you know, then you throw in like modern industrial farming and the chemicals and like, you know, California Central Valley, et cetera, et cetera. Like we have a lot of shit we could, you know, have to
it's true. Like we haven't even really like tackled rather like even beyond the large scale like destruction of the environment or like the you know the changing of the climate. even like the old like 80s and 90s type of pollution like is still rampant.
It's still rampant.
Yeah, but
like the shit that like RFK Jr. was like popping off on like way back, like what he made his name on back in the day before he became a dangerous. Anyways, maybe we'll talk about him later. But yeah, it's like that type of thing. Of like the Hudson River is being poisoned by all these companies who just don't give a fuck. Like there's a ton of that going on in America. And you're right. Like even after we deindustrialize, maybe it's maybe nature is healed.
Well, we're not going to deindustrialize. That's the thing. Like, it's totally possible. And this, you know, to get back to Loach's question, in terms of like whether eugenics is like coming back into the popular discourse, I don't really think it has ever left the popular discourse. It's really like a perennial fascination of people, right? Like,
and especially the elites it takes different guises, but like they've always been in, sometimes it's sublimated. I think the late 60s, like the Population Bomb book and like the Club of Rome and like, oh my God, like we're going to have too many people on Earth, you know? Like that was a sublimated Cold War era version of like, we need to get rid of some of these fucking poor like brown people. Like this is too much, you know?
Yeah.
And it's like if you read between the lines and saw some of the same people, like their lifetime allegiances, you'd be a little sussed out. And I don't know, just like Georgia Guidestones bullshit. Like, clearly,
that's like one solution is like billions must die. Like, you know, or I don't even know if that would solve any of the problems that are being like posited. However, like that's, you know, one solution is that like billions of paroles must like be destroyed because like, you know, they're taxing us with their lives. And frankly, whether it's like an actually like a program of like eugenic extermination, like that basically, I feel like that almost has been the decision that's been made, like to minimize the impact. But like, yeah, you know, people are going to die but it will, you know, that's acceptable. I don't really know what the long-term plan is, but it doesn't seem like anyone's actually going to do anything about it. They're just going to allow the climate to change, and we'll just have to adapt our lives to it, such as they are. I don't know. Like,
that's kind of my instinct of like how it's going to probably end up going down, which makes it weird that there's still kind of this belief that we like if we change everything right now, like they always change the date, but it's like we have 10 more years before it's irreversible. We have 5 more years. Sometimes now people are like, no, we're fucked. Like we waited too long. It's over.
Yeah.
And stuff. And I mean, that's a genuine political challenge of trying to like radically change the economy for a thing that like hasn't happened yet. You know, it's a lot easier to get people on board when I mean, now we're seeing there's little shit that goes on, like the rain that California saw this year. My place flooded 5 times. It was ridiculous. Like it was so much rain. I've never seen that in my entire life. So like that's a little weird. And then other strange weather patterns around. I guess sea levels rising in the long term is going to fuck up a lot of, you know, coastal cities. But we are going to have to. It's not like there's going to be one day where we wake up and like, the climate killed all of us. Like it's going to be a slow moving disaster.
No. And it's
over the course of years and years.
Yeah.
And it's going to hit.
It's not
like,
going to be like the
South
Chomsky
hardest.
thing of like, this is where humanity is going to be destroyed. Like we're, you know, this is the extinction. And that's why Donald Trump is worse than Adolf Hitler or something, you know, which is like, okay, well, is Joe Biden also worse than Hitler? Is Obama worse than Hitler? Because like no one like really has achieved like this sort of transformative or has even set in motion this like transformative process whereby like this is going to be prevented. I mean, I'm sure that things people have done like, you know, China or, you know, to whatever extent like European and countries and in the US, like I'm sure that like they obviously it could be worse. It could like accelerate it more, but like, you know, it's not like, I think what you said is right, that like people have kind of have this sort of very deep-seated aversion to like accepting that like the deadline passed or whatever. I don't know, like, but
there's no magic bullet kind of solution.
Yeah, and so it always kind of gets
solution.
tweaked like, oh, well, you know, we have this many more years to like achieve this new goal of like, you know, all this bad stuff's going to happen, but like, at least we won't have this happen or whatever, you know, like, at least we don't have this worse thing happen. It's like, well, it always could be worse until we really reach the point, which, you know, I feel like at that point, I I don't know. Life will find a way. It won't be Elon Musk going to Mars and us all living in a Martian paradise. It'll be like, them all living in a bubble city. Rich people living in a bubble city.
As we brought up before,
like
maybe all these terrarium dome kind of plans that all these billionaires have is really not for Mars, but for Earth, when you could have like air purified, like techno smart cities that are protected by a bubble, if things really do get that bad. And everyone else is left out in like the wasteland, like the ultimate gated community, really. And I mean, when you look at what
that's exactly
the government
what it will be like. Yeah.
If you look at what both the government and the private sector are like really investing most of their energy and money into, still these days, it's like for a better apparatus of like surveillance and control of people is really what it seems like they're really everything from AI to like fucking psychedelics to all this like tech, everything about the internet infrastructure is really like boils down to like being to track and control and surveil everybody and like manage society. So that kind of tells me that what they're really banking on is like, ooh, this might at some point cause extreme civil and economic unrest. And at that point, like if we have to put the boot down, like we're shining our boots right now. We're going to be ready for it. And I don't know if like, eco-anarchists like blowing up a pipeline, which by the way, like I'm just not about, I don't think blowing, especially after, it does hit different after Nord Stream, doesn't it? It hits a little different. That's a war crime. What Based Brandon did, what Dark Brandon did was a fucking international war crime. And like also one of the biggest emitting events. I don't think you can blow
almost
up
thought when I first heard the title of how to blow up a pipeline, I thought that it had to do with that. But I guess not. It has to do with like eco-terrorism, which, I'm not going to say like that. I mean, there's definitely worse forms of terrorism to commit, like that the United States commits on a daily basis against people in the global south and in the Muslim world. But
I would honestly be more sympathetic if it was like you were blowing up a pipeline in a country that was like the main source of like the U.S. military's energy, and you were like disrupting U.S. military operations by like blowing up that pipeline, and like that I would be much more sympathetic to than just like you're blowing up a like oil pipeline that just like is for civilian, you know what I mean? Like for civilian use, because then what's going to happen? You're going to be demonized. The feds are going to come after you if they haven't infiltrated you and like gassed you up to do it in the first place already. And then, it's probably not going to move the needle in terms of like public opinion. In fact, it might provoke, just like, like Gladio days, like Years of Lead in Italy, like doing super edgy, pressing that ultra left terrorism button in Crisis in the Kremlin, like can have a negative whiplash effect.
No, yeah, you're right. It's not very effectual. No, especially
if you're a bunch of like verso book ass DSA people that are like, I'm going to blow up a pipeline. Like, no, you're not. First of all, second of all, like if you do,
yeah. Well, of course. I mean, I'm not really up on like this whole thing, but there's no question in my mind that none of those people are going to go blow up a pipeline. It's like posing. Yeah. It's like, oh, that's really, I mean, cool. Like, look what a badass
course,
I am.
The original guy who wrote it is Scandinavian, of course, right? Because like, I just don't know where. I have nothing against Scandinavians, but I do kind of wonder like where they get off, like being who appointed them, like the secret chiefs of like the climate movement. Like, y'all have tons of oil. You live in an icy northern area that's probably going to get nicer. Because of it might flood, but like it's gonna have like a
well, you know what? They probably like. I mean, I'm not saying I don't know anything about the person who wrote the book or anything about like. Yeah, I don't know anything about the film. I don't know anything about any of this. So but I could see that perhaps some of the concern is anxiety about exactly that. Right? Those are the places that are going to be the least affected. Like the people who are already being affected are people, like in Africa. In South Asia, in South America, etc. Like the northern regions of the world are going to suffer less, sea level rise and stuff like that. But they won't. It's the places where the global north is going to be in a better position, like when things develop further. So they might be concerned about people coming there.
That's true too. Is that, and also
Yeah.
that like when people like from the global
Camp
south
of the
with
Saints
pitchforks
type
show
of
up,
situation, that's why they said this must not happen, right? That's the ultimate.
there's
terror.
going to be a point where they get overrun, like people, the rest of the world comes for them, and then they're
right, and
like,
and I very much agree with your point, which is that the preparation isn't to prevent like the changes in the environment that are going to cause that. It's to deal with that problem and control it. Right. It's like about being waiting at the border with guns to stop the camp of the Saints rather than like actually stopping like the injustice and the predations that have led to this.
Yeah.
Like,
it's about stopping the climate refugees at the border and then diverting them to a very comfy Compass Pathways refugee camp where they'll be given MDMA and allowed to process their
experiments
trauma
can be done upon them. Yeah, exactly.
And given an Esalen TED talk about indigenous reciprocity. That's really what it's going to be all about.
Exactly.
It just feels a little sus that like the kind of the most northern, whitest, and also oil producing and like NATO belonging ass people are like the most concerned. And I mean, I could be wrong. I mean, I know there's definitely probably work and discourses and NGOs and stuff like that going on in places like Africa that, like equatorial places that are going to be really heavily affected. But I feel my general sense is like that most of those countries are more worried about like actually like building up their developmental capacity and their economy and like I don't know, maybe building power plants and like if it has to be like a natural gas or a coal power plant, like that they want to get in on that one belt one road, like they still have to catch up to in an economic sense, in the sense of economic development, like to the sort of the northern countries, and they're kind of so I don't see as much like. It's like weird, like the richest, like Scandinavian ass people are like talking nonstop about climate. We got to change everything, blah, blah, blah. All these people are going to die, blah, blah, blah. And the people that are going to die don't see, like, they're not obsessing over it as much. And even though, like, they might face a very real threat, like in the coming decades of, some of these places becoming like too hot to even live in, right? And so I don't know. I just that's interesting to me.
Well,
I'm not saying that like
people who truly have no power whatsoever, obviously don't care because there's nothing that they can do, And people who have like a little bit of power, exactly. And like being able to like take off like work or whatever to go to a protest to like or throw soup at a painting or something like that. Is in a way like a luxury that the people who really don't have any kind of, social capital like can't do. Right. And they're too busy like working themselves to the bone to like survive, and to keep going like day by day, so and then people who have a little bit of power, like they're not concerned with that, like for righteously so because really the people like and China is like definitely in terms of like a country they produce a lot of like greenhouse gases, but I mean you have to think about like a lot of the world is China, like a lot of the people in the world are Chinese, and like it's still ridiculous that like the U.S. produces as much as it does in terms of like these
per capita, it's not even close.
Per capita is not even close, but even if you don't do it per capita, like the U.S. is comparatively smaller, like it still is worse.
And the biggest emitter, the biggest single organizational emitter of greenhouse gases, I think it's still true to this day, is the United States military. So, but that's like essential. Like they're essential workers, so like they don't count.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, like so the U.S. war machine. Absolutely critical, even though it's the biggest emitter in the entire world. Okay, that's convenient. So it's like hard to take people super seriously when, the one hand, all these like Swedes are like, oh, we have to, like go and strike for the climate, and then they're like, oh, please let us into NATO, Slava Ukraini, like, I don't know. It's just like, fuck off.
Well,
like,
I don't want to pass judgment on like your average person because like maybe, again, it's sort of a bourgeois thing where like you're trying to do something.
I limit that to the influencers. That I'm
yeah, like it's a very bourgeois thing in many ways to be like sort of, striking for the climate or something. And the thing is, as you said, I don't know which is more ineffectual, blowing up an oil pipeline or doing that. I don't know. I don't want to create a doom porn and say that, people should despair of this. I mean, yeah, the best you could hope for is that Yom Kiyama happens before, this is probably part of that, honestly, but,
signs and wonders.
Yeah, but I don't know. Yeah. I don't know what the solution would be because it would be like the people taking back power and, making a decision to the benefit of everybody, like in a truly generous way, but I don't know how that would happen.
Yes. That's like the missing fucking Jenga piece of the whole thing for me, is that if you do not change if you do not have some kind of like real substantive like political revolution basically that redistributes power and like how resources are being allocated to everybody, like you're gonna have a dystopia, like when things get bad with the climate. And I mean, if we accept that things are going to get bad with the climate kind of either way, at least if you had a different system, you could figure out ways to mitigate it or kind of move people around in a more actually equitable way. But like as long as we have like these capitalist institutions and billionaires and like weirdo fucking politicians in charge, we know that's not going to happen. Like they're going to end up kind of serving the ends of the current system, which is like going to be like gated community mentality, like let billions of people die or whatever, while pretending that's not what we're doing. And the people that already have the most power and the most wealth are going to insulate themselves from the horrible shit that's going to happen.
And that's really like, if you're just like doing these protest action things, you're ultimately just kind of like begging. I mean, I guess it goes because like maybe who you're begging is like you're begging all the people to like wake up and then like seize power back, like maybe if everyone realized how urgent this is, like, but everyone is like so either like anesthetized by bullshit or just like unable to get out from like their routine and like just trying to like so immiserated and just trying to live day by day, like obviously this is basically the central problem of all politics. Like, why doesn't everyone just like fucking end this bullshit? But I don't know, like, obviously I don't have the solutions, as I've always said, and I like hate people who pretend that they do, and I don't want people to be in despair because of that, but also like, I'm not gonna lie and pretend that I feel that, there's some hope that I don't feel. So I don't know, but
without being too doomered out, like because I'm not saying there isn't a solution out there. It's just that like I think it's important to be honest that one is not ready made like out there right now that you can
and certainly begging in the current political system, it's not possible. Like because and begging them like they're not going to do anything about it.
Possible.
They're not going to
like actively
exactly like they're not going to do anything about it. And that's where there's kind of the element of retreat. Maybe bringing it back to the von der Vogel thing. Yeah, like the whole idea like we're going to retreat, we're going to get away. We're disgusted by these people, we're moving away from them. Like it's a similar thing where it's like just kind of throwing up your hands because maybe even if you imagine that they're going to be influenced, like it's still ultimately like. I don't know. I still feel like it's ultimately not productive, or it ultimately doesn't have an impact on those people, or it ultimately doesn't. It can't move the needle because, as you said, the system is configured in a certain way. So in a way, even though it's behaving as if like we want to change the system, like you're sort of just like throwing yourself at the feet of these people. You're registering your disgust, not necessarily by retreat, but you're registering your disgust by like stopping the metro or something, but you're still just registering your disgust, and that doesn't make any real impact on people because they don't care. Like, and even if they do care, it doesn't actually change their behavior at all.
No.
They only want to like
pisses them off.
They only want to protect their fucking metaverse utopia where yeah, everyone is like, and that's what I think, you know, in terms of like, oh, are there going to be climate lockdowns? Maybe, but more than that, like that served as a way to like, what I think is like, it's not so much like, oh, this is a test for something, and then we're going to like, run the same program again, like in the future. There might be an element of that, but something that I think is like less appreciated in terms of COVID is like, you know, now people say like it's over, but so many things have changed. Like this, the way like Zoom is configured, all the rush like towards like these different things, like everything that COVID occasioned, like all of the different sort of pushes like towards certain things, like, you know, the development of like video chat and like even the development of like AI and things like that. All those things, like to say they're not inflected by the situation of COVID, like is naive. Like those things, like a lot of the things that we're seeing come to fruition now were things that people attended to because of the pressure that they felt from COVID. And now, like, just because, like, now the pandemic is kind of over, you know, I don't know, some people say it's still, like, ongoing. But regardless, I mean, I guess I would agree in a way, like, that it still is ongoing because we have just accepted, like, certain new aspects of life that, you know, so eventually, yeah, it's going to be perpetual lockdown is what I mean. Like, we're going to be locked down all the time. Yeah, it's not like
exactly a new normal that's not like it's just how like 2002, you know, was not like after 9/11, there was kind of no going back to 1999 after that. Like certain things stuck, and I think it's the same case with COVID.
And people are going to want to be locked down because that's going to be where the air conditioning is. And that's going to be, you know, like it's that's
so dark. Yeah.
Well, that's what's going to be like in places like in the Gulf countries. It's already kind of like that.
No, for sure. And also the big thing that I don't know if I sent you this, but there's actually a surprisingly good like frontline documentary about, you know, quantitative easing and the zero interest rate era, and it really like reminds you of how much crazy financial fucking alchemy was going on throughout the entire 2010s, and really it's a good reminder that it like puts that decade that we just went through in proper context, because especially the COVID era, because they pumped, you know, the Fed pumped so much fucking money into the economic, you know, into the financial system in like March of 2020. And we actually, I guess, were facing a 2008 style collapse, like a bigger one than 2008. And they responded by dumping like exponentially more money than they did when they bailed everybody out in 2008. And, you know, that is, we're living with the inflation of that right now, obviously. The like absurd unaffordability of like any real estate in a major city is another thing everyone's having a lot of fun thinking about. And, you know, like we're in a bizarre like economic time where we have like low unemployment, but like high inflation, and all these tech companies, like the party's over. You know, now people talk about like, oh, when you reference something from just a couple years ago, like, oh, that was a zero interest rate phenomenon. Couldn't happen today. And it's like, it's so true. All these bullshit Silicon Valley companies, it's like, I knew something was fucking off about you douchebags with your little ball pits and your yoga rooms and like all your optimistic fucking, you know, TED Talks about how you're changing, you know, WeWork is changing corporate real estate forever. Everything's changing, you know, we're all making the world a better place. And like all these unicorn companies that were never profitable, but like they were able to almost form like monopolies because the Fed was just going, you know, nonstop. And so that's another thing, that a lot of the COVID lockdown stuff wouldn't have been feasible, both with like the Fed dumping money and also, you know, the U.S. government doing something very weird and, you know, not typical, which is like cutting checks to everybody to stay at home and do nothing, like universal basic income. And that created some very unique particular dynamics. I think that's why 2020, the summer of 2020, was so lit. Honestly, like that's a huge factor of it, is both like the kind of like the fatigue of the lockdowns and the pandemic status that we were all living in, and then like the fact that people had money or weren't necessarily working, and all kinds of stuff like swirling together. And so I don't know, but that doesn't mean just because the zero interest rates went away and the quantitative easing doesn't mean they're not still fucking. they got plans and they're still fucking with us. I think they're gonna keep doing that.
Yeah.
So yeah. Anyways,
yeah, I guess it's a satisfactory answer. I don't know.
Yeah.
Too many people going underground. Too many reaching for a piece of cake. Too many people pulled and pushed around. Too many waiting for that lucky break. That was your first mistake. You took your lucky break and broke it in two. Now what can be done for you? You broke it in two. Too many people sharing party lines. Too many people never sleeping late. Too many people paying parking fines. Too many hungry people losing weight. That was your first mistake. You took your lucky break and broke it in two. Now what can be done for you? You broke it in two. Too many people preaching practices. Don't let them tell you what you wanna be. Too many people holding back. This is crazy, baby. It's not like me. That was your last mistake. I find my love awake and waiting to be. Now what can be done for you? She's waiting for me.
Should we move on to number 2?
I guess so. Yeah, very good one.
All right. So, Spen asked on November 18th, 2021, can you guys give your perspective on Whitney Webb's work?
Yeah, again, like you were saying, that we got to go faster, but it's interesting how, this is like pretty, because we were just having some discourse about Whitney Webb, I think both in the Grotto and also in the P2C Discord, because she had come up, she had...
On Twitter.
Yeah, she had had a, well, I wouldn't have known because I'm blocked. For
Oh, really?
well, yes, for refuting like bald-faced lies that he posted about me, despite me never engaging with him once. But sorry.
We're
literally completely
ignored
ignored him, but then he just started like spilling nonsense about me that some fucking person, I guess, emails him. I'm talking about Aaron Good, by the way.
The good doctor himself.
Yes.
One of Subliminal Jihad's largest detractors these days. Really kind of came out of nowhere as quite unprovoked, we should add, to be one of our proudest haters. And so, yeah, it's interesting because then, he's popped shots off at a few different people, I'd say over the last like 6 months or a year. But it was just about, I think, a week ago when he was taking some shots at Whitney Webb, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, I think as it often happens with the good doctor, he kind of got a little ratio action going on. I think it's safe to say.
Yeah.
Got his ass handed to him a little bit in the replies. Yeah, definitely not the first time that's happened. And it actually was kind of illustrative of maybe like, kind of how I don't know, complex feelings I have about Whitney Webb's work. I mean, this question asks about her work specifically, and while I think, let me see if I can actually bring it up, because I think what he said is actually like an interesting jumping off point, I think, to talk about Whitney Webb, though he sort of stumbles off the diving board and like falls in the pool backwards. Nonetheless, he said, this is on April 17th. He shared a interview, I think a recent Whitney Webb appearance on Jimmy Dore's show, and they were specifically talking about Jamie Dimon getting called to testify in that Virgin Islands kind of case relating to like J.P. Morgan Chase and Jeffrey Epstein. And I watched some of this. I've seen a little bit of her coverage. She's sort of on the beat of this right now. But Dr. Good said, because he has a PhD. We want to emphasize
my fellow
here.
PhD holder. Yes.
Which is, I don't know if the good doctor knows that.
Well, it's only recently true that I have successfully defended my dissertation. Now obtained my
SJ
doctorate.
Has
so,
credentials now.
Yeah.
You're serious.
Yeah. Well, but it's my degree isn't in the amazing discipline of political science, which is just really, everyone with a political science degree can absolutely just has, a firm handle on everything that matters in the world, and like the most, it's definitely a credential that's meaningful because, as
one of our most untainted disciplines. Yes. So Dr. Good, PhD in political science, wrote on April 17th, quote tweeting this interview. Why does Whitney Webb say this to Jimmy Dore, at Jimmy Dore? He's tagging him. I
think that's important because it almost seems like he's like snitch tagging Jimmy Dore, like, which is so funny because like the idea, this goes to, we're supposed to be talking about Whitney Webb, not complaining about this guy. And I don't even like to, like, when we get in these stupid beefs on Twitter, like I don't even like to bring them up on the show, even though,
I know.
like, people act as if like our show is just like a fucking roast fest. I mean, maybe I just have like a really high tolerance
the butcher shop full of beef. 24/7.
Yeah, exactly. But generally, no, I don't even like. But I think it's like it really attests to this sort of mentality where it's like, everything that he says about Whitney Webb could be said like 1,000 times about Jimmy Dore. Yet somehow like there's this blind spot, I guess, where it's like Jimmy. Anyway, continue. Sorry.
He says, why does Whitney Webb say this to Jimmy Dore about the mob and the spooks without ever mentioning capitalist oligarchs, the real beneficiaries? She never even says, quote, capitalism. How does this analysis fundamentally differ from Alex Jones? So let me click and read 108 replies. To this tweet.
So yeah, like the idea that like Jimmy Dore, who's like a full blown. Okay, sorry, continue.
Can I just let me just read it because I forgot he kind of doubles down in a way that actually is what got him dragged. He says, he goes on to say in this thread, this is like Danny Casollero's octopus on steroids. I don't say this because I want to be catty or someone who obsesses over every little point. It's the fundamental issue. Arrest mobsters, dissolve the CIA. We still have an oligarchy of corporate wealth. This can't be an oversight. She could clarify everything just by saying capitalism is organized crime, or alternatively, she could just explain why she thinks capitalism is not the problem. Much of what she says is important and on point. We should be worried about the WEF et al. Plans for totalitarian and centralized control of a digitized money system because these are parafascist initiatives to institutionalize imperial capitalist despotism. Seeing the responses here, I assume this is after he started getting attacked. I think Whitney Webb's dubious efforts to conceal her politics just make the issue weirder. She's a right-wing conspiracist. I don't mean that as an ad hominem. I mean that she is pro-capitalist and she is a proponent of the, quote, conspiracy theory of history. So Michael Parenti has his conspiracy and class lecture. She and others would say, no, it's just conspiracy, which if people want to think that, whatever. I am in the minority regardless, and I can't expend lots of time debating first principles. The response, and then he gets attacked more and then says, the responses are just more confirmation. Whitney Webb has a lot of right-wing followers because people with right-wing politics follow people with right-wing politics. People with fundamentally different political views from me. There's not a whole lot else to say about it. Okay, well, Then he says later to Caitlin Johnstone, good research, not so good analysis. So, I mean, he got dragged pretty hard. I think partly like taking a pot shot at Danny Casolaro as being like a right-wing conspiracy thing, I think is a little bit like, I'm not saying Danny Casolaro was like a hardcore Marxist or anything, but like his work, I mean, we'll do something about the octopus.
Well, yeah, my read on this is that,
like,
okay, well, since it's coming up, I'll just say that like my take on this was, I think we're going to talk about, shortly, that like a lot of like he's not like totally off base. Like there is like a critique to be made of Whitney Webb, like in certain ways. However, like when he's saying like, oh, where's the analysis? Like this is I'm not making an ad hominem. This is simply a political difference. Everything that he said about Whitney Webb like could be said like 1,000 times more of people that like he's just apparently completely cool with. Like, and analysis is actually, as I said, earlier, like in text, like analysis is actually analysis. It's not just like a shibboleth or like just something you recite where you say like, I'm a Maoist, my dude, or like heckin' communism like is the way. Like if Whitney Webb said that, what would that be really meaningful? Would that change the substance of like what she says? Like no. And like if she were, I think that she is like anti-communist in a way. Like, but even if she said like that she was a heckin' communist, like, and then turned around and said like, oh, like the predecessors of Jamie Dimon were trying to create a one world government with this, like in collaboration with the Soviet Union, and like weren't actually anti-communists, but were like somehow pro-communists. Like that would not change. Like the substance of what she said would still be anti-communist, even if she said like capitalism is the problem or something. I don't know how that would cohere, but like.
I think, we've seen before that I think Dr. Good has a very big blind spot or he puts a lot of weight on just people like saying things, but like not questioning if somebody has ulterior motives for saying things. So like he's very comfortable if somebody wants to say they're a heckin' Maoist and they go on, I don't know, to produce something that is like not very Maoist or is just like dumb or dilettantish or whatever. He's like, yeah, but they've stated their first principles up front. So it's very debate club kind of vibes. And I mean, that's the frustrating thing is he's not, I actually do agree like with the substance of a lot of what he's saying there. He just finds a way to somehow make it kind of like alienating and also like slightly
also like yeah, sure, but who cares? Like that's the thing. Like what is like how relevant is this? Like it doesn't, necessarily like again, like her work is still so much more valuable than a lot of people who are out there saying like I'm a heckin' Maoist, like even though like there's definitely flaws. Like one of the class analysis, like the sort of anti-communist undercurrents, like are definitely like the uninterrogated kind of anti-communism that like maybe seeps in from like some of the like even going on Jimmy Dore's show I find to be suspect, like in and of itself, like and again,
and I mean that's
you
one of the more
reach a different
left-wing
audience.
shows like.
She went on Glenn Beck. Yeah, exactly. That's incredibly.
Did she go on Tucker? No.
I mean, she would probably, like, if she were invited.
Though, ironically, like, Aaron Good has been, like, talking all week. After he had this thing against Whitney Webb, he's, like, kind of soft, like, well, Tucker actually, he is
that's the thing. Like, he's the
And
biggest
like,
pusher of, like, how come, why is it that only Trump and Tucker are the only ones who criticize the CIA? Like, how come no one, like... Yeah, like that's just as fucking like bullshit, like right wing talking point. Basically, I literally like I saw him fucking saying that Seth Rich was killed by the DNC or something, like because Julian Assange alluded to it or sort of said it without he kind of implied it and he took him at its word. So like,
see, that's the thing. That's not very hard crackling analysis, like not realizing that, and I wouldn't even.
You could make the same sort of things of like, why are they
but-
concealing their political beliefs? Like it's just kind of like again. So
Well, yeah. Why are you hyper vigilant about Whitney Webb, but you're not hyper vigilant about
what's
like all
interesting,
kinds
like,
of other people?
he kind of acts like it's his
weirdly
job
selective.
to like gatekeep quote unquote, like parapolitics, and just throw
gaslight, gatekeep, good boss. Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
He acts like that's like it's his job, almost like he's paid to do it. But I mean, the only thing that suggests otherwise is that he's very bad at it, and just is constantly like eating shit. But yeah, it's weird how he has this sort of like hall monitor complex where only he and like a certain cadre of dirtbags are like have the authority. They're included. They're given the PhD ijaza to expound on any of these topics, and everyone else needs to just be like shit coded into oblivion. Because like, I mean, yeah, that's true, but like that has its place. Like there can be like maybe like it's interesting because like he also does this type of thing where he's like sort of gesturing towards like this rapprochement between like left and right on certain issues, which like I definitely can be critical of, like things like that. I think that can be very like that can be like definitely like entryist bullshit like in many manifestations. But like when there was that like anti-imperialist like march that he was defending or whatever, again we're just like ripping on this guy, but he did start it with me. Never said anything about him, and he just started like making up lies or proliferating lies.
He called you the alpha guru of the incel parapolitics cult.
That is true. But
you are the alpha guru.
That is true. No, sorry, I was being ironic. So maybe kind of
LOL, I'm alpha.
LOL, I'm the alpha guru. But
I don't even know what that is. So yeah,
I guess he means like I'm the Andrew Tate of like our incel cult. Yes,
we're not the ones that start fights with women on Twitter every week.
Yeah, but there was like that sort of anti-imperial march, right? Where like a bunch of people were boosting like
Blumenthal, Anya Parampil, who like threw her hat into the sort of trans discourse,
the trans moral panic thing,
and I think RFK Jr. was there as well, and I'm sort of. I mean, God, yeah, talk about complex personalities. Another person that Aaron's like, wow, like, I don't know, RFK, like, maybe he is, and I have very complex feelings about RFK. Like on the one hand, like, oh, it's so sus. But on the other hand, I'm not, like, every attack on him has been like, he said bad things about Fauci. He denigrated our holy vaccines that are completely perfect. And that kind of shit, I'm like, you know what? Like, he actually is right about some of that shit. But anyways, that's very complex. Pulling it back a little bit to Whitney Webb, though. Yeah. I mean, I do want to say, first of all, like, in terms of what we think about Whitney Webb's work, I actually have both of her books, like One Nation Under Blackmail, volumes 1 and 2. I think volume 1 has Bill Casey on the cover. That's a good sign, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean... And I've only just started to read. I mean, I've been familiar with Whitney Webb's work since she started kind of coming out around, I think it was 2018, 2019. And I think I've been a little bit critical of her in the past, but I would put her in a very different category than some of the other people that we're critical of, who are like big time influencers, relatively speaking, particularly in these kind of like parapolitical spaces. Because what I can say about like Whitney Webb is that like she's really done a lot of real work, and like these books are gigantic. I think they're pretty like heavily indexed and stuff, and just like reading through a little bit in the beginning and then flipping through a little things there, it covers a lot of bases, like things that we've talked about a lot on SJ. And I mean like deep cut shit. Like she definitely has read Alan Bloch's Masters of Paradise. Like she goes in super hard on the Crown family. She mentions the Pritzkers, like Castle Bank, all that kind of shady bullshit, and even stuff that we've yet to talk about yet, and like the various interlocks and connections with Epstein and this whole network. And so I think she's like, just like we read sometimes from, I mean, we read parapolitical sources or we read things by academics or older historical texts where we definitely don't completely agree 100% with like maybe where the author is coming from or every conclusion they draw, right? Mm-hmm. Like we try to critically read texts and like we keep in mind who the kind of the writer or the author is and their subjectivity they're bringing. Sometimes we read things very critically, like we're only reading this because like Midge Decter's book about Rumsfeld, like she's kind of telling on herself and like revealing her deep erotic desire for Rummy. And, or something like that, or like Peter Schweizer's Victory. But also, I think a lot of people we genuinely kind of respect, like Mae Brussel. Mae Brussel wasn't a Marxist. I mean, she was like a rich girl, like a California rich girl, like kind of high liberal, like a paranoid liberal, Mm-hmm. And so sometimes like she could say certain things that maybe feel a little bit like, oh, that's like kind of naive, or maybe she'll say something that's like kind of repeating some kind of anti-communist thing, like, unconsciously. But generally, I feel like, her heart's in the right place. Another person like that is Peter Dale Scott, Aaron's idol, right? And really like the template for all of his own work, I think, in a lot of ways. But like Peter Dale Scott, Peter Dale Scott also from like a very ruling class Canadian family, like I forget exactly what his dad did, but his family was friends with the Dulleses. They'd vacation with Alan Dulles and John Foster and stuff. That doesn't mean that Peter Dale Scott's an op, but it is interesting, like the context that he comes out of. And he's also not a Marxist, but he did a lot of great work writing about, covert activities. And I think genuinely as a guy who was like, I think he grew up in a kind of proximity to that world and eventually kind of saw a lot of sus things going on and kind of dedicated his career to writing about it. So that's great. So, I mean, and then when you even get some slightly more right-wing stuff, like, I mean, if you wind back the clock 10 years and you're reading a lot of like conspiracy literature, like almost all of it had a right-wing valence, right? It's
yeah. Well,
I mean, if you go back to the 70s, there's more left-wing stuff, but like the 80s, 90s, 2000s, a lot of it had, if it wasn't not totally right-wing, but like there was a lot of, left libertarian vibes of like, I'm kind of like a liberal, but like Ron Paul, he's the only guy standing up against like the Pentagon,
well, yeah, I definitely
like
a libertarian streak, maybe I would say, yeah, definitely, absolutely, predominantly because like there's a lot of suspicion of like the federal government, like, and they go hand in hand, so yeah,
and that doesn't mean that the libertarians were not wrong about everything or that they're wrong about everything today, and some of their like the critiques they've made. And I used to listen to like James Corbett, is kind of an old school, more like libertarian conspiracy researcher and people like that. And Alex Jones was more straight up like a libertarian. Then he became like MAGA pilled and stuff. But I mean, I do think, when you're saying like Aaron Good poses the question, how does this fundamentally differ from Alex Jones? Like what Whitney Webb is saying. And I think that's like a cheap shot. Like Alex Jones is a different kind of animal than like Whitney
They're
Webb and Alex
definitely
Jones
different
don't
types
really
of animals. I think that one of the big differences is honestly, I think that Alex Jones is primarily like insincere and disingenuous, like with aspects of sincerity, whereas I think Whitney Webb is primarily sincere and less sort of like agenda driven, and less of like a demagogue. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I used to have kind of this critique about Whitney Webb, I think like a few years ago, because I did pick up on this, that it's true that she doesn't really wear kind of her political beliefs like super loudly on her sleeve. She likes to present herself as an investigative journalist and is really just kind of reporting the facts of the case. And I think like to a large degree that's true. Like when you read through the book, it's basically about like the intersection between organized crime and Western intelligence agencies and stuff like that. Like most of the content is pretty factually accurate, quality research that's kind of laid out. And it's not like complete, like Alex Jones does a lot more to spin all the information. Even if Alex Jones is telling you something that's real, he spins it much more aggressively in a way to like fit the Alex Jones cosmology of, his, anti-globalist kind of libertarianism, whatever. And I don't think like, I don't think Whitney Webb is on that tip. However, I think especially when you get to kind of like the takeaway part of her writing and like the analysis part, that's where you see a lot of like more libertarian kind of assumptions kind of seep in. And that's where I would have like the most critique of her work. Like just as an example, I think I sent you this of just like recent media appearances that she's been on. Because I was just looking to see like, okay, what's she up to today? And like, is, can I detect any kind of, political valence and stuff? And, it's like she went on Glenn Beck kind of recently. She went on Jimmy Dore. She kind of is in this space of like, probably appeals more to like libertarian right-leaning types these days who are maybe in some senses like more receptive to her book about Epstein and all that stuff right now. For a variety of reasons. But she also like will go on like, Jimmy Dore, Jimmy Dore is like a Tucker approved leftist. So there's that. But the one that I think, I forget which show it was, but I mean, she was talking about Jamie Dimon, like we had said, like she was talking about Jamie Dimon to some other podcaster or YouTube guy. And she was describing all the various connections, and she's quite good at this. Like, she has good recall. Like, she knows. That's what I put her in a different category than some other people we've criticized who are much more, let's say, like dilettante-ish, and kind of you can kind of tell they're just like skimming Wikipedia articles, and like they aren't. They haven't really put in like the fucking hours to make themselves like an expert on.
She's passionate about the research, and even if there's flaws, and there's like I don't know. Again, this is like kind of like contaminating the Whitney Webb question with like this recent issue, but or this recent thing that sort of came up. But I think it is an interesting like conversation point, even like aside from like our antagonism or our acrimony with Aaron. But in academic work, there's often like a missing component. There's often like an element that like you can never really talk about anything, right? And I'm not like saying again. This is like an Aaron Good thing where it's like, was this peer reviewed? I don't think that American Exception was peer reviewed anyway. But regardless, I think like there's often like a missing category of analysis that you can bring in. Nothing is ever perfect, right? There's always like some kind of flaw, right? So if there's like a third triangle that's like left out, doesn't mean the rest is like not valuable. And like there is, and even if this sort of analytic, I'd say like the vast majority of academic books, like there's some kind of criticism you can make like that, where it's like, they skipped over this thing, and again, like he does acknowledge he's in a minority, right? Like there's not like most people, for better or for worse, like the concept of probably in the ideas of both of our listeners worse, for most people like are averse to the communism and Marxism are things that most people like hate the notion of, right? Like they have a visceral negative reaction to it. And in a way, trying to like raise people's awareness about these things. Again, we definitely should get into the critique of Whitney Webb and this Jamie Dimon thing, because I think this is important. But I will say that like in a way, it's interesting how like that is kind of like, and I feel like, in our own approach, the way I see in terms of like, being kind of in the same field as Whitney in some ways, or at least adjacent to it, where this like comes up like in our sort of, kind of circle or milieu. My approach to this topic, like whatever you want to call it, is it's really about like marginal or unofficial discourse, right? It's really about like seeking out information or seeking out like sort of outsider knowledges that are not like outside the sort of official narratives or mainstream narratives or orthodox narratives, right? So that requires engaging with people who not only do you disagree with, I mean, at least Whitney Webb isn't insane. Like there's people who are like just straight up like insane who still like have perhaps valuable insights.
Even just in the Epstein beat, like there's so many kind of like sus lords that have like that have built influencer followings that are like either very unhinged or
Whitney Webb never bragged about
peeing
faith on dead Arabs. She never did that. She never flew anyway, but to my knowledge, I hope that she hasn't.
I don't think so.
I mean, yes, I would say she's a libertarian and that she doesn't, I'd say she dislikes communism or has a certain aversion to it. But that is pretty common in American culture. Like, I think, even, in the vaunted academe, the halls of academe, even people who are on the left, like in terms of orthodox Marxism, Leninism, or communism per se, people are critical, like, and not all of their critiques not all of their critiques are invalid, I should say either. Like, there are certain, like, the position that like the Soviet Union never did anything wrong or whatever is not like, I'll say that's not a serious position, but like I actually mean it. Like, you obviously, need to be able to your worldview needs to be able to accept that like this is not like a perfect polity, that there's like,
and like
you know,
no matter which way you slice it, that is not a like a proper Marxist position.
No.
That like literally the Soviet that's a fucking meme, you know, like
Yeah.
that's not Lenin would like be so disappointed in you if like he saw you saying that, you know what I mean? It's
And-
like no,
yeah.
that's
and
like
simply the
you're-
idea, like, yeah, if you say, like, what about, like, you know, and it's funny because this is someone who is taken in by these people sometimes, like, or people like this, like, you know, what about the MAGA communist people who are just, you know, GOP supporters, basically, except, like, they have this sort of pose that they, like, you know, are Marxist in some way or communist, or, yeah, they were just taking Marxist-Leninist positions, like, at what point does this become superficial? You know, is like someone like Haas, like, you know, more deserving of solidarity than Whitney Webb because he says, you know, certain words?
He's a vocal Marxist-Leninist. Yeah, like, no, yeah, absolutely not. Yeah, so these labels that we apply, it's also weird that, like, Aaron Good polices these labels, but I don't think he self-identifies publicly as a Marxist or, like, a communist or, like, even a socialist. But he's, like, very anti-capitalist, which is, I mean, that's fine. That's, you know, I'm anti-capitalist too.
Yes.
But that's a little fuzzier it's just weird to like run around policing like you never say I mean, I guess his
almost,
real critique
yeah,
is
it's
you don't
interesting
say
that, you know, because I thought we're not
capitalism.
supposed to start beef with other researchers, right? I thought that was wrecking, right?
The
I thought
most
that was
pathetic
and
record.
clout chasing.
Clout chasing
yeah.
at Jimmy Dore, at Whitney Webb. Like, I mean, he's editing the shit out of everybody with huge followings, like, try to start a fight.
I thought that you weren't supposed to, do that.
But no, yeah, no,
no matter what they've done, you're supposed to just, you know, recognize that they have the same first principles. So, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, if you just say, you know, drenched in irony that you hate capitalism, my dude, then you're good forever. Yeah, but you know, Whitney, it's like, yeah, I don't see anything productive about like starting like a very nitpicky beef with like Whitney Webb. At the same time, I think it's fair to point out where you have like disagreements and kind of maybe our analytical
and people
framework
do that, but it's not like people do that all the time, and that is important. That should be done, but.
Yeah.
Like that.
I mean, everybody, we were saying like Symposia, oh, they did great work, but like, hey, there's a couple things that maybe like I'm not saying like they nefariously like won't touch this, but it's like, oh, maybe they missed, or they're just not as focused on this, or maybe like they have a different relationship to kind of gaining respectability than like we do. Like we're a little more like wild cards, so like we can go off about how it's all MK Ultra all the way down, but like I get why they're not necessarily, and I think there's an aspect of that with Whitney Webb that is partially just like, I mean, she's an author now selling her book, and like the flourishing sort of like right-leaning media sphere happens to be much more into like talking about Jeffrey Epstein's sicko crimes and want to know more about it than like honestly a lot of liberals and leftists. Like took quite some time. Even people that focus on Epstein like took a very long time to have her on, or you know, kind of or acknowledge her work in any way whatsoever. And so yeah, I don't think, and the work itself is good. You know, I've been talking to Ed Berger a little bit. Somebody said that Ed Berger should come on SJ, and I've invited him on. So he'll be in a little while. He'll be on, but I think he provided a lot of. She acknowledges him in her book as like I think essentially a research partner, somebody who provided a lot of like raw research into all these criminal networks. And I know just in brief conversations I've had with him, like on Twitter, I mean, that guy really knows his shit. Like, I mean, he's up on Liberia shit. He knows all about, fucking Bruce Rappaport, like all these networks, Castle Bank, like dude knows his stuff. And I think he is more of a left-leaning person from what I understand. So I think, Whitney Webb working with somebody like that, yeah, I think she has certain libertarian, I think her partner as well, Johnny Vedmore, also might have certain, like, actually he might be, I think maybe he was a Corbyn supporter, maybe at some time. So I'd kind of classify them as like left libertarians kind of. And so that can open up opportunities for, I think, sometimes like in the conspiracy sort of analysis realm where it can that analysis can like miss the mark a little bit. And we are in very complicated times right now where it's like Tucker's calling to abolish the CIA. Davos is like a bunch of people are saying Davos is like a bunch of Maoists that want to implement world communism. Like it, like all the signifiers and shit are very scrambled right now. And I think it's easier than ever for people to get kind of spun around and like forget, like lose their kind of, sense of where the political X and Y axes are at the current moment and stuff. So I think, okay, like an example of that, as a friendly critique would be this Jamie Dimon thing, where she was talking to this guy a few weeks ago, and she starts off kind of talking about the context of like the people that kind of put Jamie Dimon in power, like elevated him in the early 2000s, were deep in like the Epstein network, and he's kind of like their boy in a way. And then she starts talking like further back, like some of these other bankers and connections they have. Eventually she brings up something that I think is a very interesting data point that we're going to get to later, is that one person kind of involved in all this is a Samuel Pizar, who's a very prominent attorney who is this, she says, little fact check, sorry, but she said it's actually the stepfather of Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. Anthony Blinken's biological father was actually a banking partner of one of the Warburgs, very powerful.
Yes,
European
she does call him
family.
her stepfather on Unlimited Hangout.
Okay.
Yeah,
So she might have just But she calls out this guy is very fucking interesting. And the next time we go back to Alan Block, he talks about Samuel Pizar a few times in one of his books, and this guy was all up in. He was doing a lot of very weird sus outreach and like business outreach to the Soviet Union in the 80s. Yeah. He was also the lawyer and best friend and confidant of Robert Maxwell, Keelan's father. This is a whole very rich vein of territory to kind of mine. And Whitney Webb, I think, goes into it, I think maybe in volume 2 of her book, but she clearly like has read up on all this stuff and knows it. Where I differ a little bit is then she brings up Samuel Pizar's role kind of negotiating business stuff in the Soviet Union in the 80s.
Yeah,
and
he was on the American Committee on U.S.-Soviet Relations, formerly the American Committee on East-West Accord, right?
Yeah. And then she talks about this committee and all these bankers that were on it that were always trying to open up more normalized like trade relations with the USSR. But the conclusion that she like draws from that is that these American bankers had like a plan since the early 70s to kind of like partner with communist countries, like initially the Soviet Union, but then later China also, to create like a new one world, economy, as she says. But basically that this is going to be like offshoring all the industrial capacity of the West over to the totalitarian communist countries. And then, we would control like global trade and all that stuff through the dollar and through, finance and Wall Street and everything else. And thus, like, this is a terrifying, plot that they had to basically create like a one world economy kind of thing through like a sinister merger of like corrupt Wall Street capitalists and evil totalitarian communists like coming together, kind of working on the same team. And I just like, that's where it starts to get into kind of Anthony Sutton libertarian territory where I'm like, okay, wait, hold up.
Yeah, that's
kind of not the conclusion I draw from it.
Again, yeah, I can see like there's like an angle to it, right? Where like, for instance, like because these people would like be talking with and meeting with Gorbachev, then like her read on that will be like, she takes out this quote in her treatment of this, like on Unlimited Hangout, right? She like talks about, Gorbachev visiting Silicon Valley, and she says a Washington Post article on his visit quoted John Scully, then head of Apple Computers, as saying, "I think Gorbachev got to us. We'll all be thinking about business with the Soviet Union in a way we wouldn't have if he hadn't come." So it's kind of like, making it seem like, Gorbachev is the one influencing people, getting to us, when really it's the exact.
Exactly. And I think because I'm actually reading a book for the next Demon Forces right now, I had to read a fucking book by Strobe Talbot. Guy, one of the greatest like waspy DC names ever. Strobe Talbot, longtime best friend of the Clintons, wrote this book because I guess he was somewhat he was working for Time ostensibly at the time, but he had amazing access into, it's almost like a sequel to Victory, but written by like a centrist, like sus, maybe CIA liberal. And it's like a play-by-play of the Bush administration's like relationship with Gorbachev and the fall of the Soviet Union and stuff. And I haven't read the whole thing yet, but I mean, it's actually pretty clear-eyed about like the game that Bush was playing to kind of manipulate Gorbachev, starting, and like how there were a lot of games being played that were kind of political and for show. And like, for example, Bush told Gorbachev, like privately, like when he was running for president, he's like, I want to continue the work that Reagan has done in like promoting peace and stuff, but I'm going to have to say some things like when I'm running for president in order to win that like, but ignore them, like don't pay attention. So he went and campaigned and was like, I forget exactly what his attack, but like he's still a communist. We can't trust him. We need trust but verify. And he was talking a much more hard line, kind of appeasing the hardliner conservatives, in the GOP that were still kind of sussed out by all this and like thought Reagan was like going too far and stuff. So Bush, especially being such an elitist as he was, had to sort of keep his anti-communist bona fides like out there. But secretly he was telling Gorbachev, like, no, dude, like we're totally gonna have peace, like keep working with us. Like there's a lot of delicate management going on of that like relationship. Also, I don't know if Whitney Webb mentions this in either of her books, but it's funny that you bring up Gorbachev going to Silicon Valley because none other than Samuel Pisar arranged to bring Steve Jobs to the Soviet Union. I think it was either in 85 or 86, but it was like right after Gorbachev took power. And he took Steve Jobs, who brought like Apple computers with him and shit, on this like kind of official tour of the USSR. And I have to read more. Alan Block mentions this in one of his books, which jumped out at me as kind of like, what's going on there? And kind of showing off like all this fancy computer technology and like, look, this is what you guys could have if you like turn to capitalism and shit. So there's a lot going on there. So yeah, I don't think that, casting that in a sense of like Gorbachev was like playing us. Gorbachev got played. He got played like in a world historical, like massive sense, right?
Yes.
I think we can agree. Like Gorbachev didn't win whatever was going on there. He got fucked over in the end. And
he does
everything he was trying for failed.
She does mention the Steve Jobs trip, actually. She says, notably, Apple Steve Jobs was advised by Samuel Pisar. Jobs later stated in his 1985 trip that the USSR had been facilitated by an international lawyer based in Paris, and that Jobs had a feeling this attorney worked for the CIA or the KGB. That lawyer was almost certainly Pisar. But the idea that he worked for the KGB, for instance, like, this is another passage that I think is a good example and like I want to discuss. But, as a frame for this, everyone has a point of view, right? Everyone has blind spots and biases, right? So that doesn't mean that like this is not useful, but it is important and it is material to talk about like, what the actual goals were. Like, was this, the subversion of like American patriotism and like the, the United States? Because that's kind of the picture that we're getting, like, that these rogue financial, organizations were trying to kind of subvert, American nationalism and create this one world economy, right? Or one world government, kind of on this like totalitarian communist model. But, so here's a paragraph, right? So she says, notably in the early 1970s, Samuel Pisar told Congress that the world was moving toward a single unified world economy in disregard of national frontiers and even ideological boundaries. He stated that all conventional tools of national policy, it seems to me, are rapidly becoming anachronistic, as the state itself, even a strong one, is no longer a defendable economic entity. Paisar also claimed the main drivers of the shift included the multinational corporation and the dissemination of technology. He later frames technology transfers by multinational corporations as giving rise to the quote-unquote trans-ideological corporation, where, quote, capital private enterprises and, quote, communist state enterprises freely intermingled and formed joint ventures. When asked if these trans-ideological corporations were forces for good or for evil, Paisar responded that, I believe that on balance they are a force for good, but qualified that depending on how governments and corporate management act to make certain they become forces for good. So that, I think, creates a certain picture. But if you look at the document, right, this subcommittee hearing where he's sort of being interviewed, right, what he's actually sort of doing is describing a strategy that the United States needs to pursue in order to defeat communism. That is like the entire, point of this. Like he's in fact pitching it to Congress, right?
Yeah.
So it's not, for instance, he says, permit me to start with words that are harshly critical, even though I hope to get onto portions that are constructive as well. I am of the opinion that after years of unparalleled progress on our foreign economic policy in a rapidly changing world has become stale, incoherent, and counterproductive. I say this from convictions born of a rather unique perspective of an American lawyer practicing in the heart of the common market and an observer of trade relations between the West private enterprise and the East state enterprise system. I speak for no client and no special interest, but in strictly private capacity from personal belief and observation. Then he talks about JFK, and his policy.
They went to law school together.
Yes, right.
Yeah, Paisar and JFK were in Harvard Law School together.
Yeah.
They were friends.
So he says, 2 decades ago, we conceived an ambitious negative policy towards the East. Its hallmark was selective embargo. In activating extensive export controls, discriminatory import restrictions, and severe trading with enemy laws, we hope to arrest the economic and military progress of communist nations. That design has failed. It has failed because long-term embargoes are a two-edged weapon. If an upstart colony like Rhodesia, with the weight of world opinion lined up against her, cannot be brought to heel by means of this type, how futile is it to attempt to subdue the Soviet Union or mainland China? As a result, today, the United States faces two huge blocks, one in Western Europe, one in Eastern Europe, as well as a mammoth industrial power in East Asia. The first bloc fears our alleged economic harmony, the second our alleged military imperialism. Both are repeatedly overcome by bureaucratic paralysis dictated by political interests of their most conservative states, and by diplomatic preoccupations arising from their own complex interrelationships. Yet the leverage we have to safeguard market access to these blocs and their pet associated areas has dwindled from the time when we were chief, almost solitary architect of global designs. So the point of this is to protect our position as a chief architect of global designs. That is the United States. Not to
if you
dissolve
embargo
it.
the shit out of if you embargo the shit out of the Eastern Bloc, then you actually forfeit your ability to more directly control their economies because they're cut off in a different system. But if you have joint ventures, and access to Western capital, suddenly you get a little tentacle in there. And then, Whitney Webb actually brings up the technology transfers in that same interview and casts it in a
they were
very
giving away
light.
technology that allowed them to catch up to us.
Which I've heard before. That might be an Anthony Sutton line, and I've heard that from a lot of more right-wing libertarian, anti-communist people over the years, which I especially don't like it because it's kind of negging and it's reframing the historical economic progress that the communist countries did make by saying they would have collapsed years ago if we weren't giving them helping them cheat. These traders were giving them all our fancy technology. And while that did go on, I think to jump to the conclusion that they were trying to even the balance of power in the Cold War expressly so that we could merge the capitalist West and the totalitarian communist East together into one sinister world economy, I don't think that's specifically what was going on. Yeah, like you said, this is a strategy of subversion and getting your tentacles in. And in fact, that's exactly what happened, and it played a critical role. Both this underworld shit with people like Paisar and Rappaport and others, when Perestroika and Glasnost started happening, going in and doing these kind of joint venture things. And then also the IMF loans that were given to Yugoslavia and a lot of the Warsaw Pact countries where they accepted kind of this poison gift in the 70s of finally taking loans from the West And they had, that made things easy for them when oil prices were really high. And then the 80s, they ran into all these headwinds, and all the IMF fuckers came around and were like, all right, time to pay up. And they couldn't. And so they had to reduce services to the people, which pisses people off. They had to, cut things in their economy. And eventually, the IMF, they always do this. They bust you out like the fucking mob and say, all right, like, give us your electricity grid, privatize your airports, like, give us your TV station or something like that. Like, you need to start privatizing these things so you get them in a vulnerable position, and then you can start to fleece their fucking economy. So that's how I see it, in terms of what historically went down.
Well, yeah, in terms of what, like, this document that's being drawn upon, in terms of what Pisar said, that is what he said. Like, this is actually the really relevant part that I think is worth reading this, like, at length, because, not at extreme length, but like at a full, like, block quote, because it shows, like, what's left out, which is, like, the very clear orientation of this. He says, Mr. Chairman, all conventional tools of national policy, it seems to me, tools which interfere with the natural flow of international business, are rapidly becoming anachronistic, both here and abroad. The state itself, even a strong one, as the recent monetary storm in Germany has shown, is no longer a defendable economic entity. Everywhere, inexorable forces push toward a single unified world economy, in disregard of national frontiers and even ideological boundaries. In the West, the multinational corporation, the Eurodollar, the dissemination of technology, and the growth of rapid communications are the instruments of this trend, and a foretaste of what the future will be like. In the East, capitalist private enterprises and communist state enterprises are beginning to form joint ventures for mutual profit through a dogma-shattering development that might be called the trans-ideological corporation. Inside this vast and shifting landscape, our posture as a nation, as a leader of nations, has become awkward, if not embarrassing. We are reacting to international economic and financial developments in makeshift fashion, without a consensus on where we wish to go, hoping for things that have not been, and probably cannot be achieved. The current monetary crisis suggests that other countries look upon us as a creditor looks upon a debtor. For Europeans, the dollar has become the object of an erratic love and hate affair. They welcome it as the fuel of trade and investment, and they despise it as the harbinger of inflation commanded from afar. Mr. Chairman, they are afraid of it and afraid for it. Understandably, the main focus of our economic policy will be upon action at home and interaction with the West, Japan included. But the problems of our domestic economic adjustment and the continuous squabbles with our closest allies should not obscure our long-term interests in the arena of East-West relationships. For here lie not only the potentially vast and hungry markets, but also unprecedented opportunity to supplement the thermonuclear standoff with a businessman's peace, a peace we can best afford, across the weakening ideological ramparts of Eastern Europe. More than our far-flung and costly military establishment, which, alas, we must not, we dare not, yet mantle, it is the tender weapon of our superior capacity for economic progress that will prevail in the historic contest with communism. So, a very, very different framing, like when you see like what's left out, right? And that,
what this sounds like, actually? Soros. It sounds like what Soros ended up doing, basically.
I think you're spreading a conspiracy theory of history right now. Karl Popper would not and would be upset. That's where that phrase comes from, by the way, the open society and his enemies.
Yeah, he's describing the Popperian open society dream, basically, and that like you're going to use economic power to ideologically like dismantle. What was the phrase he used of like, like critical ideological damage or something? He
wants to create a go across the weakening ideological ramparts, and the tender weapon of our superior capacity for economic progress will prevail. There's a dogma-shattering development, which is the trans-ideological corporation. So,
dogma-shattering development, exactly. Yeah. And it did. That's it literally, it was like a mind war and like an economic war, like simultaneously.
Yes.
And it shattered like the reality of like actually existing socialism in pretty much all the European countries, whether it was, Yugoslavia or the Warsaw Pact or the USSR, it like irrevocably like shattered it and made sure there was. It's interesting that he says like, but there's no ideology in the future, but it's like that is an ideology. Like implicitly, this is like global neoliberal capitalism.
Yes, in terms of Whitney Webb's framing, like it's actually like she's partially like right, because like a lot of the things he predicted are like aspects of like global homogenization, and like we are creating like a globalized economy that is subordinate to like multinational quote unquote trans ideological corporations, right?
Yeah.
Like that are, but the thing is, where the sort of the pitch to a certain audience comes in is that there are certain investments, and again, everyone has their own like blind spots and investments when they're doing like research and writing, especially when the analysis comes in. Like it's a constant struggle to get like past these. So rather than like attacking someone, it's rather to like you sort of like hearken them to like notice to invite them to like conceptualize this. But I think that there's a certain investment in like, one, American patriotism, and two, anti-communism that are pretty prominent on like the American like libertarian right wing, which is, as you said, like definitely a constituency for like parapolitical research. So like if you're trying to play to that audience, not that I think this is necessarily a conscious thing, I think that there's ways that like this could be addressed perhaps. However, like, yeah, like when you lose the fact that this is like very consciously like the design for like the dominance of the like American financial institutions and of capitalism per se, then that is a problem. Like, or that is something missing.
I will give Dr. Good his due that he is right about that. That like if you really go up the food chain and travel up all the interlocks, like eventually you're going to run into like the capitalist elite. Basically, like there kind of is no daylight, and often, I mean, it's very dynamic, but basically the intelligence agencies, people who serve in government, who go in and out of government, people like Anthony Blinken, these lawyers, kind of mob adjacent motherfuckers, like all these people oftentimes like, maybe like the driving force of, various operations that they're doing, not always, but like often would be at the behest of a corporation or to serve, because in a certain kind of perspective, like, I think you see this from the origins of like the CIA. There's a tendency to look at something like, this guy in Guatemala is going to nationalize, do land reform and take a bunch of fucking farmland away from United Fruit. You know what? That's a national security concern. That means American corporation is going to lose fucking money. So therefore it's a national security concern. I think it's like very deeply baked into the logic of how like intelligence agencies operate, even though there's often various ideological kind of dressings that they kind of put on top of it to sort of, I think, even mask that from a lot of like the your everyday like person. Because like when we say CIA, oftentimes like we're not even talking about just like your normal bureaucrat spook. Like we're talking about like the Allen Dulleses, the George Bushes, like people that move in very high circles in the world, and have the juice to like turn, the Pentagon or the CIA like to their will. And like, I don't know, just the idea that even though I get that, I think she also brought up actually something that didn't Barrett bring this up, like the 90s Chinagate scandal with like weird shit going on with the Clinton administration. I mean, that's actually a very, like, I'm not saying that, I think these are all really valuable things to like look into. And I think the Chinese case is more complicated because there was a period where China and the US, I mean, we actually did offload our entire industrial capacity to China. We never did that with the Soviet Union. Like the Soviet Union, we kind of talked about it and dangled it in front of them a little bit and then like double crossed them and like destroyed their country. But in the case of China, no, we actually did like enter into a very for a while, mutually productive partnership, from the perspective of American capitalists, at least. And now that's starting to crack a little bit. But there was a period, where it's like we talked about Bill Casey hanging out with the head of Chinese intelligence in the 80s. And there were definitely like underworld kind of connections. Like there was kind of Chinese money like floating into the U.S. economy in the 90s in weird ways. And maybe there was even, I think maybe from the American side, they thought that, oh, this is a great, because I mean, in a way that did come true. Like America offloaded all of its industrial capacity to a communist country, which then was like, the workers that produce everything, and then we like continue to lord of the world with like the petrodollar and our banks and our advanced technology and shit like that. And the elites were just having a field day. It was wonderful. Like from the American elite perspective, it was totally awesome. And now I think they're getting a little nervous about it. And so I don't know that to bring us up to today now, I try to be very careful with anything. Like, for example, like in the Biden administration, I mean, you turn on Fox News, even without Tucker, all you're going to hear about is like CCP-linked Biden family, like they're in the pocket of the CCP and stuff. And I mean, there are like weird Hunter Biden like business connections in China, absolutely, and stuff. But at the same time, like the U.S. is really, I think, it's not just the right wing. Like all of the U.S. apparatus is moving towards a more confrontational stance with China over Taiwan and over the Ukraine war and everything, and their diplomacy efforts, in like Saudi Arabia and in Africa and things. So, I think it might be too easy of a conclusion to jump to, or too clean to be like, yeah, like Biden, just like how, Trump's a Putin agent. Like, I don't think Biden's an American puppet at the end of the day, right? Or, whoever's got the most juice in America is probably the one puppeteering Biden. And now I find it hard to believe like Xi Jinping and like the globalists, like in the West are like actually have like a long-term plan together to form a one world economic dystopia under horrible surveillance. Like I don't think that literally is something that is happening. And but it is to say that, yeah, maybe China's in a kind of a more liminal position. Our Cold War is a little more gray with them than it always was with the Soviets. But I think I can confidently say that the Soviets, like, were not, and even when I think Whitney Webb at some point mentions that, like, oh, they were working with contacts, these underworld guys were working with contacts in the Red Mafia of the KGB. I think there was a book called Red Mafia that we came across, right? We didn't read it. Mm-hmm. But even that, I think, deserves much closer examination, because what do you mean when you say the Red Mafia? I think it's easy to jump to a conclusion, because Americans grow up hearing this shit nonstop, that it's like, oh, okay, well, yeah, obviously the KGB was the most evil, corrupt organization ever. They were completely totalitarian, and everyone was afraid of them, but they were also completely inept and corrupt and pieces of shit. So they were obviously a mafia, because nobody really believed in communism, et cetera. And so, like, yeah, there was this Red Mafia. But, like, I don't know. When I hear Red Mafia inside of the KGB, I think of, like, traitors that made deals with powerful people in the West to betray, like, the Soviet Union and facilitate its collapse. Like, a ton of gold went missing in 1991, I think, like from the central vault, in Moscow before the Soviet Union collapsed, and like it was never found. So they think like KGB, some people in the KGB probably, jacked it and took it off to Switzerland or whatever. But like there clearly were, kind of fifth columnist like type people that probably were working with like Western forces, intelligence agencies, business people, etc., like preparing for like the downfall of socialism and the explosion of like capitalism, basically. But to say that like the entire KGB was like plotting with like evil capitalists in the West to destroy the Soviet Union, I don't buy that. In fact, like it was a lot of the KGB and military people that like tried to overthrow Gorbachev, right? In the coup in August 91.
Certainly, like, again, it's like, yeah, I think it's also, there's certainly like connections and like interlocks, and there's relationships between these things. But that doesn't mean that Xi and like Biden or like, all the sickos like are getting in a room together and they're like, this is how we unite the world, like under, the reign of the Antichrist or what, like, something like that. That is something that happens like through all these like different agencies, like pursuing their own power, which like, does ultimately take like a similar shape. I think honestly, like, again, like PSAR has like a pretty like illustrative exposition of it. Like he says, he gets asked by a Senator Rybakov How about China? Do they need our trade? Do they want our trade? Can it ever have any significance to us? Because apparently this iceberg is cracking. Where do you see us going, or where do you think we ought to go with China? This is in the 1970, by the way. Mr. Chairman, I would not want to answer you in the context of what has come to be known as ping-pong diplomacy. I do not understand that kind of diplomacy, and I'm a little afraid of it. When people play ping-pong, they inevitably smile, and you never know what is behind those smiles. Looking at the more concrete evidence we have, it is a startling fact that today 80% of China's trade is with the capitalist West and not with the communist East, whereas in the early 1960s it was the reverse. Now, how did this come about? The Russians were industrializing China. China purchased from the Russians in the late 50s and the early 60s all kinds of plants and installations and infrastructures that were designed to help them make that great leap forward that Mao Zedong was talking about. But once they started to abuse each other over who spoke for the purity of communist doctrine, the Russians got worried and they abruptly cut off most supplies. Again, I feel like that's probably not an accurate representation, but anyway, many of the very...
I don't know, though. Khrushchev. And again, Khrushchev. Little liar. Fuck you.
Many of the very expensive plants that that the Russians had built in China never became operational because the Russians refused to supply the turnkey. The result is that all of the expensive material is rotting in the rain, and the Chinese will never trust the Russians again. Being people that know how to handle dialectics, the Chinese are now entering a phase where Russia was in 1925 when they asked Henry Ford, the grandfather, to come and help them build an automobile industry. The Chinese are quite likely to come to the United States, probably operating from a Canadian base in the beginning, and invite some of our major companies to sell them American equipment and know-how. It is interesting to note, Mr. Chairman, the basic telecommunication equipment and transportation equipment of China is American from before 1949 when the communists took over. This was never replaced. It would be very easy for them to say to American companies, we need your spare parts, we need to update the system, which is basically an American system. Now, should we or should we not respond? It is a delicate question. I believe we should. Nothing too strategic in a military sense, perhaps, but anything that helps them build up their economy. The people that should be most worried about our selling this type of technology to China are not so much ourselves, but Russia, because they are right there, next door. This is a strange game of ping pong whereby not the two players, but the bystander can lose out.
Yeah, very prophetic. And then Nixon and Kissinger open up, right?
Yes.
I mean, it's very prophetic. And that is, I mean, we always go back to, we've end up going back to this thing a lot that I want to dissect more in the future, but like the consequences of the Sino-Soviet split, that's another thing that like normative kind of libertarian anti-communist analysis often gets wrong, is they don't delineate the difference between Russian, like Soviet communists and Chinese communists post Sino-Soviet split. Mm-hmm. Like it's all bad communists. And I think a lot of people maybe forget, or they don't get reminded enough that these countries were beefing from the early 60s onward, and it had profound consequences for like global geopolitics, and it ended up pretty much getting exploited very cleverly by America, starting with opening up to China, and then through the 80s, like we got the Chinese kind of to help us in a lot of our geopolitical power plays. And oftentimes they were on like weird sides of history, like invading Vietnam in the late 70s. Like, what the fuck? Like, and like arming the Mujahideen, like to get back at the Soviets. Like people that were paying attention in the U.S. foreign policy circles, like really glommed on that and realized, I mean, the debate is even going on today. Like that's Tucker's whole beef, is that you should never let China and Russia like become allies, because then they truly like they're too powerful. It's like you can get in a bar fight with one guy, but then if like his three friends show up, you're fucked. And like I think that might be driving a lot of the anxiety today around like the war in Ukraine and stuff that we see is like you kind of happen to agree with, but it's coming from a different place than you are, where they're more worried about China at this point, and they figure, like, why piss off both of them at the same? Like, we really want to piss off China, but we can't piss off both of them at the same time. And this is like a long-term way of thinking in like the U.S. foreign policy establishment. And so, yeah, like the idea of him saying we should open up to China, that does not mean that he's a secret communist, right? That might be the misinterpretation.
Absolutely, right? Yeah, absolutely not. It absolutely does not mean that at all. it's the opposite, right? Like it's
and oftentimes you can get a lot more with, what do they say? Like a lot more with honey than with vinegar or whatever the fuck. Like, it makes sense that they would have people that have friendly relationships with the communist countries to do kind of like low-key diplomacy and open inroads into their economy and stuff like that. Like that's one of many tools in a toolkit. So yeah, I think libertarians often jump to, or just I think their identification of like totalitarianism is so wrapped up in like communism, basically, that when they look at things like the COVID lockdowns, the vaccine mandates, things that are going on right now, even RFK Jr. does this, where he kind of says, like, totalitarian governments are always the same, like whether it's, Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Russia or Mao's China. And I'm like, oh, come on. Like, why are you lumping those all in together like they're exactly the same fucking thing? Or that like totalitarian, it's a very Hannah Arendt kind of thing that's very like a lot of Americans just accept that like totalitarianism is just like a type of government that encompasses all the bad governments that we don't like. And
yes,
like it's almost like it is an ideology unto itself rather than being like a thing that various ideologies resort to under.
And it's also
some
like
are more liable to do it, but
I mean it's also like it's a different paradigm of like how to control people, like maybe, but again it's really hard to see through like what is like actuality. Like again, like it gets down to almost like the experiential level of like people's feeling of like self-actualization, like because it's like okay, the premise of that is that, for instance, like in like a liberal democracy like the United States, like this is not totalitarian, but of course like our freedom is restricted in many ways, and a lot of the things that like a lot of the quote unquote freedoms that we have are actually like disguised mechanisms of control. So it really comes down to like the experience. Like we don't feel free, like even though our society is quote unquote not totalitarian. Whereas like did like every Soviet or every person in China in the 1970s not feel free? Perhaps not. But again, it's like kind of it's sort of a vain distinction in a way. Like there's like a contrast that can be made, but I'm not really sure like to how much like it holds up to reality and how much of it is like an ideological thing. Like again, like this is I like,
don't like it because on the one hand there are increasing mechanisms of control all around us. We all see it, we all experience it, and like we know that it's getting bigger and more. Like the all the momentum is going towards control, and it seems to be like the majority of the people that end up in power are pretty jazzed about that and want to use that, and like they will use it if they get like an opening to, so in the sense, okay, I could say that there are like a strains of quote unquote totalitarianism, but it's so deeply identified with like communism, which like you could call some of the policies like totalitarian, but it was happening under such a different context. Like I do think it's like,
I mean,
like
and also
worth
shit
pointing
like
out the distinction between
and like a lot of it relies on the distinction, which I think is maybe partially like the critique of Whitney Webb in some ways, where there's a sort of distinction between like big business and like the government, where like really they work together and like one is like often supportive of the other, like capitalist multinational corporations and like the state are deeply intertwined, including like the deep state, right? So it's like, and I think, I think that's, I think Whitney Webb does like acknowledge this.
She does acknowledge this. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. But this is like this whole idea that like, if you have like the cops, like, if there's like police like on the street saying like, you need to go here, that's like totalitarian, but like you have to, like, you don't get election day off. You have to like work this many hours a week in order to survive. You can't like live without a roommate. Like you have to pay for like all like health insurance. Like, that's not totalitarian. Like that doesn't take away your freedom. That was exactly, that is freedom. I feel like Stalin made that exact point. Like when Anna Louise Strong interviewed him, maybe back in the 1920s, that was literally his argument. Was like being poor is like totalitarianism. Like,
well, it is.
Like, he's got a point. Like, and that's why I would. That's where I would say like, even if you feel like ultimately, like the end wasn't worth the means of like what communist governments resorted to, their goal, I feel, is like laudable and rational and like good overall. And you could say that maybe they deviated and it maybe the dark forces of human nature just blah, blah, blah. And that's why we can never try it again. But, when you look at our system, it's like the express intent of it. Of course, we dress it up in language. But really, when you look at like the laws and the way everything's set up, it's like, no, like a very small group of very wealthy people get to control, like basically be an oligarchy and control everything. And the law like backs that up. And we're all just supposed to be like, yay, like that's freedom.
Exactly.
And
freedom is the sort of ideological gloss that's put over it. Whereas like maybe freedom wouldn't be emphasized as much as like a positive value. Like that's where like the liberal component comes in, where like this is how this is all being justified and rationalized, is through this logic of freedom, that like if these oligarchs didn't rule us, then like we wouldn't be free. Like that's the price of freedom, is that like we have to be ruled by like a small cadre of oligarchs. But like that's bullshit, and like that is like the level of like, that is just like the rationalization. That's just the ideological gloss. Whereas like if you said, oh, this is necessary for equality, or like this is the dictatorship of the proletariat, that's a different explanation for like things that may be unjust as well. Like,
Sure.
So again, but it obviously like,
and I do think there was an element of like them being less like sneaky about displaying like their sort of authority, because their goal was on its face like very like laudable in a lot of ways, whereas like the capitalist has to mystify everything through like 10 layers of psyops and abstraction. So like they're going to hide when they use their authority. They're going to try to hide it as well as possible, because then people really are going to be like, what the fuck? And, meanwhile, they're like, well, we're doing this for the people. So,
yes,
it's
also like a
there's
cultural,
little less shame around it.
Yeah,
there's
cultural and
things
ideological difference. Yeah, that like it's just a matter of emphasis in certain ways. And that doesn't, like, when it comes down to, I've always found it like the whole thing is like people give up their freedom for security, like to be like one of the dumbest like bromides in the world, because like if you don't have security, you're not free. Like if you don't feel secure, if you don't feel safe, you can't actualize yourself. It's like a false binary in my view. Like I obviously I get what people are getting at, but like it's a false binary. Like the idea that like, if you don't feel free and you can't actualize yourself. So the idea that like, oh, because they're like, they don't have the ability to participate in a capitalist marketplace that like enables this rule by these small cadre of oligarchs. They don't have freedom, so they're like unhappy. But do they really feel like less free than Americans feel? People who are, I don't think that's necessarily true.
I don't think so. I think even Joanna Stingray made that point. Joanna Stingray made that point about like visiting the Soviet Union in the 80s and how like it actually like, yeah, there's certain things you couldn't do, but like basic rent was like almost free. And like food was super cheap, and there was like public transportation everywhere, and like you had to have a job, so like you had a way to support yourself. And of course, like not everybody had exactly what they wanted and all these other stuff, but it was like, oh, like if I wasn't, she was talking specifically about like underground rock musicians and how they all had day jobs, like they all had pretty stable lives. She's like, yeah, like you could think, oh, they're so oppressed because they can't get on Melodia. But like in America, you'd be like working 2 jobs and like fucking in debt and like stressed out all the fucking
Unless
time.
Unless the CIA decided to finance you. But
yeah.
no, but like
exactly.
Like
there's a lot of nuance there.
No, for sure. Like, and I think that very, very
and
much.
When people
true.
invoke it in just this casual way, like what, like because of COVID, like it's like what, this isn't Stalinist Russia. Like I just like wish people wouldn't invoke that, because it obscures the people who are really doing the bullshit, which is like the Western elites, like the capitalists. Like the call is coming from inside the house. The
when it comes to the history,
from inside the fucking house.
When it comes to the Cold War history, like especially to like suggest that this is about like this group was actually working in some way for the Soviet Union and trying to like subvert like the like America or something. I don't know if that's like really what's meant to be, like if that's really like what the big takeaway is supposed to be, but like that reading is certainly like possible. And like I feel like there is a little bit of like avoiding the sort of very heavy Cold Warrior aspect of this stuff, And I think in some ways, like the analysis of the ultimate desideratum of it like holds up. Like we do have like a homogenized globalized economy, a more integrated world economy than ever in history, like partially because the Soviet Union collapsed, like not because it became a one world government or whatever. So like the multinational corporations are a defining characteristic of that. So like a lot of those things like did bear themselves out and definitely are worth like mentioning. It's a very interesting and compelling history, but in failing to acknowledge the sort of Cold War aspect of this, like especially when it comes to the Soviet history, it's a big oversight. I don't know if that's like ideological or if it's just as simply there's many factors that could produce it. Something to like consider, and there's all like there's many like once you get into that aspect of like these things, that's something that definitely coheres a lot of these sort of linked intelligence, like organized criminal and financial operations during this time, or corporate operations during this time is this sort of Cold War context, and often sometimes it does move across these lines, but a lot of the time it's kind of with, for lack of a better word, like imperialist motives. And sometimes for the imperialist is the perfect word.
It was quite literally. And we won that struggle, in the context of two different economic systems. One of them triumphed, and it was ours, the capitalist system.
Pizar got everything that he wanted in terms of what he describes in this hearing.
The liberals and the conservatives, they all got their piece. The liberals were playing a more sophisticated game in a lot of cases than the ravenous, anti-communist types. But the goal was kind of similar, was capitalist penetration and undermining, the ideological, social, economic undermining, and neutralizing them as a political force.
Yeah, and to protect our position as the world leaders and make sure that exactly.
And become the leader of the world.
AKA,
and
and this is
I think
this
we have to reckon with that.
Yeah, and this is a we thing. This is it's not like we're working together. Being at this hearing, it's listen, you are the representatives of the state, of the government that is quote unquote representative, and I'm the sus lord, and this is how we need to I this lawyer and also someone who works within the quote unquote common market. This is how we together can win.
Exactly. And they did it. And I don't think it's because he was a secret communist in any way.
No, because then he would have lost.
Well, yeah, I mean, there were a few that, Kim Philby or whatever that fled, over the years. But in general, all these guys that were, so interested in opening up the Soviet Union, really played a critical role in its dissolution. And that is what a lot of them, it was a lifetime passion of theirs to destroy the Soviet Union. They were all obsessed with it. So, the idea that Bill Casey is a secret communist, no. No.
Yeah.
No, he's too fucking Catholic for that. No, definitely not. He was a sicko, probably maybe a pedo, but definitely a nefarious dude. But that dude was a Wall Street lawyer. He was he was all about, the freedom of business. And I don't know, even diving in all these conspiracy theories, reading a lot about this stuff, being able to merge it with the kind of I don't even want to say Marxist theory, but yeah, somewhat Marxist theory, but also just the Marxist political position of the 20th century of these governments and these parties and all these people and how they were reacting to what the CIA was doing. And I was damn, actually they were kind of calling this out while it was happening and being this is fucked up. You guys are being sus imperialists, blah, blah, blah. And actually, I think there was a lot of coherence to their worldview and their, maybe not down to every fine point, but it was through looking at this parapolitical stuff and then kind of going back to some of the Marxist theory and political writings where I kind of got pilled on while not perfect, in the grand view of history, these are kind of the good guys. And I think Americans just have to, it doesn't mean you have to start LARPing as a communist or whatever the fuck, or be be a self-hating KKK person or, I think the performative Marxism actually doesn't help because it's it doesn't approach people that might be like kind of susceptible to like hearing out, a different an alternative history argument by front loading kind of like conflict and like you're a piece of shit and stuff like that. So I don't know, but I found it to be a very like these two things actually synergetically work really well together. So so I think I think they should be.
Like to me, the good guys like in history are like, I don't know, like the oppressed, like people of the earth. Like, like it's not like any state or government
I don't even
necessarily. If there really are indeed good guys, like, I mean, I
identify them more with the oppressed people of the earth than our own side, basically. I think maybe it boils down to like that.
Certainly,
like who was more
the
on
current,
the
current. If we were looking at like, what is the current threat that like we people need to be mindful of, like as we enter into the future, like who are the people who are making the decisions about what our lives look like, in the future? Are those people communists? No. Whatever they say, that like, I mean, I guess you could say like, in China, is that a different situation? I mean, again, it's a sensitive issue, but it's a little bit of a gray area. But like, certainly like, his vision, like the multinational corporation, like that is the defining characteristic of like what is, the global economy that, and the mechanism of control that we're subject to now. And like, it's true that like maybe a lot of these people were maybe less ideological, like, they weren't afraid of like ideological contamination. They weren't like people who would like at the idea of like working with a communist, like, integrating with a communist state organization, like my corporation. Exactly. Like, no, like they weren't like that. But
these are like
they
Ivy
still
League
like
Yankees.
They were I don't even know if they were ideological capitalists, because like their capitalism was like second nature, because it just is a development of their own greed and lust for power. They didn't even think about it. Like they would do whatever they could to secure like their own power or their own control, which is tied with the control of these financial institutions that are embedded with like the U.S. state.
It's also, it is worth mentioning, because there's like so many examples of it, that like if a lot of these powerful lawyers and kind of operators were running around actually like they actually did have communist sympathies and they were setting up joint ventures and shit. I mean, like just one interesting example is Larry Eagleburger's partnership with Yugo Motors in the late 80s. Like he was partnering up as a lobbyist, I think after when he was out of government in the 80s and working for Kissinger Associates, he was like partnering with Yugo to like sell Yugos in the United States and shit like that. Does that mean Larry Eagleburger is a fucking Titoist or a communist? Fuck no. In fact, he played a role in destroying that country a few years later, partly because he was so intimately familiar with it. And so the idea that somebody like of kind of power, influence, access, whatever, starts doing business deals with the fucking Soviets, I would say that like if they're a communist, they would potentially be in a world of fucking hurt and trouble with their own governments for doing that, right? Like people found that out during the Red Scare. Like you can't just pal around with Reds, right? You'll be blacklisted. You'll have your career destroyed. Yeah. And everybody learned that lesson. So the odds that anybody that is doing that shit in the 70s and the 80s probably has some deep connections to like the national security state, maybe is a CIA asset of some kind, or or a high level corporate person that's like part of that whole milieu that is working towards those types of goals, so that whether they're an officer themselves or just somebody that maybe has relationships with CIA people, they're probably reporting back to somebody about what they're up to, and like they're being watched, and they're not communists, like they're doing some like little market infiltration work. And that ended up being very important, like when it all started collapsing. So, yeah, probably not. I think the odds of a genuine communist existing in like the deep state underworld milieu for decades, or, much less like being dominated by such people, is like not, that is, I think, ahistorical. They didn't win. and the Chinese communists are like maybe they're a somewhat separate story, but they're also their own thing. I don't think I definitely do not think they're puppet mastering
they're
first
of all they're definitely not. They're not. Their economy isn't identical to the U.S. economy, but they're heavily integrated and what Pizar described in terms of the future of China, where you have sort of these communists or companies, these communist trusts acting like capitalists, and their economy. His vision for the future for it becoming as much like the American economy as possible, that has banned itself out. They're nominally communist. They are not identical to the U.S. and its economic structure. Exactly. However, I don't think that we should pretend that they're really anti-capitalist. I don't know what your take is, but
I think it's highly nuanced, and I think it's not so much that they're kind of against capitalism. They're so much more integrated than the Soviets were in the global capitalist system but I could see them transitioning. I think they feel it. My impression is that they feel like they can achieve a lot of their goals by maintaining kind of the general structure of the international capitalist system, but there might be some changes they want to make to whether, what the global reserve currency is, different kind of trade agreements,
yes,
things
those
of that
things
nature.
Are different. But
and that might have an evolutionary,
is their
difference.
vision a society without capital? Is there did we really believe that we're moving towards even that China right now is a dictatorship of the proletariat or something? No, I don't know.
It does seem to be a little bit different than the Deng Xiaoping, Hu Jintao kind of days when they were very, very about just kind of promoting capitalist development.
Yes.
And that was,
they
were really, really, they never fully abandoned kind of Marxism. She talks a lot more about Marxist theory, and it is much more forward with that kind of stuff, but at the same time, it's it's complicated, I think. So, I'm sort of sitting back and watching how it's all going down, but I don't think they're puppet mastering the world. They're also very different from the Soviet Union, so they're very integrated with the world, and in the past have been somewhat complicit in certain things. I mean, there are times maybe it was China didn't feel powerful enough to stand up to the U.S., and now they do. It might be a little bit as simple as that they've built up their productive forces, their military, their international prestige, and now America is going to come at them with that attitude they have, and they finally are powerful enough to go a little wolf warrior mode and say fuck you, whereas they had to play very nice with the Americans for 30, 40 years and just kind of you want to invade Iraq, okay, just make sure we get some of the oil. And we're not going to say shit about it.
Do we think that they wanted to say don't invade Iraq?
No, not particularly. That's what I mean.
Yeah, exactly.
They were because they were so integrated. I think there was a lot of behind the scenes stuff, but they definitely, that was not a breakup moment between the U.S. and China. But now when there's conflicts, even though China is publicly playing a very neutral role, they've definitely gotten a little more assertive in not going along with the U.S. or pursuing alternatives and things like that.
Yeah, they usually
so things are changing. It's not static.
Yeah, of course, it's evolving.
This one world paradise that Pizar dreamed of, I wouldn't say it's about to go away overnight, but I think it's running into some serious structural headwinds after about 30, 40 years. And I think that's where you see a lot of the insanity and the anxiety and stuff, and just the out of sortsness of the U.S. elites right now, because it feels fuck. We've had it so good with our petrodollar and all this other shit, for 4 decades, and now the credit card bills are kind of coming due, and there's other people and we've shat on our own reputation around the world. A lot of the world rightly doesn't like us very much right now, right?
Yes.
So I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know what. I think you're right that there is a shift in power. Again, that there's potentially a shift in we talk about multipolarity, but maybe a shift in the poles of power, or definitely an emerging sort of weakening of the unipolarity that has existed for a while, so especially since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And a little bit before, but I don't know like what that reality like looks like, or if I'm not necessarily like, again, obviously like no one can ever. The United States right now is like the biggest like force of evil in the world, definitely. And and so I hope for its destruction in the future. Like, will the force that replaces it like be better, like, or more heroic, or will it even be replaced? Will it like weasel some way to like, either adapt and survive or like continue to prevail? Stranger things have happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or like, will the status quo just continue for like, longer than people imagine? Because that also could be the swerve, like where sometimes unexpected things happen and usually this is the case, people lack an ability to imagine things different from how they've been. But, sometimes the surprising thing is that things sort of stay the same. So I wonder if this sort of like this integrated relationship and this kind of lukewarm it's like not even a cold war, it's like a cold peace or like a cold cooperation. If that status quo will continue, we'll see.
Yeah, it's heating up a little bit, but
there have been like sort of some flare ups. There have definitely been some flare ups, but I don't know. Yeah, I'm still kind of skeptical. If there's like some kind of like engagement with China, I guess that'll be my my Russia was never going to invade Ukraine moment, because I'm still kind of there definitely have been some flare ups. So I should
some Taiwan shit
this.
popping off.
Yeah. But
the entire world has ditched them. There's things going on, but I cannot try to predict what is going to happen. In the next year or two.
I'm pretty skeptical. I mean, if it doesn't happen, it'll be blamed on like CCP Biden, but I feel like CCP Trump will also like not. I mean, this is one of the reasons why. It's interesting how Trump actually is the most left-wing person, because he said that Xi was brilliant, right? So I'm sure that they'll figure out some solution, right?
Yeah, definitely.